Hello and welcome to this special live webinar about the upcoming EMF changes to UK amateur radio licences. In March 2021, most UK radio spectrum users, including radio amateurs, received a letter from Ofcom explaining that they would soon be introducing new licence conditions aimed at protecting the general public from excessive radiation from wireless transmissions of over 10 watts. Although this may have come as news to some amateurs, Ofcom announced their intentions a while ago, and the RSGB have also been working on this for some time and has already published many articles and advice to members through Radcom and other channels. Leading this work for the Society is the EMC Chair John Rogers M0JAV, and I'm pleased to say that he's with us today to present an update on the latest EMF licence changes. So welcome John, can you give us a quick rundown of what you'll be covering today?
Yes, thanks Dave. I'm going to outline some of the ways that individuals can assess their configurations, as they're called, to show that they comply with the new requirements and how they can keep records of that fact. And I just want to emphasize one point at the beginning, and that is to remember that although these new regulations come in next month, it is 6 to 12 months before you have to have done the assessments. Thanks.
Well, indeed, John, thank you. And before your presentation, a reminder that if you're watching this on Saturday, the 24th of April, then this is live and you can add comments and ask questions on either BATC or YouTube at any time during the presentation or straight afterwards. Please include your first name and call sign if you have one within the message. And also please note that you can make this video stream fill your screen on most devices, usually by double clicking on the picture or pressing the full screen button. But now it's time to go back to John and find out more about these new licence changes.
Okay, thank you. Ofcom introducing these changes next month, and basically they're going to implement measures to require compliance with international guidelines which limit the exposure to electromagnetic fields. So what's the license condition all about? In our stations, we all have an antenna, and most of us know that close to that antenna is an area where the electric and magnetic fields can be strong. That's called the exclusion zone. Outside of a region, there is a compliance zone, which is where you are compliant with the ICNIRP, International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection regulations, and that's where members of the general public need to be in order for you to be compliant. Now, the bodies, our bodies, are efficient at removing excess heat. When we run around, we sweat, we pant, we breathe faster. But if the rate of absorbing energy is greater than our body's capability of getting rid of it, then it can lead to harmful effects. Also, if the electrostimulation is strong enough, we may actually feel it. So what ICNIRP does is it gives guidelines to limit the exposure so that if you stay far enough away from the antenna, you can be sure that there's no harm. The guidelines are slightly complicated because there are basic restrictions, and these are the levels that are needed to avoid health effects, but they're measured in terms of absorption rate. In order for us as amateurs to define whether we're staying within the basic restrictions, there are also reference levels, and these are levels in terms of electric fields and magnetic fields and power density. And what ICNIRP does is it says that if you stay within the reference levels, then you will be satisfying the basic restrictions. Gets a little bit more complicated because there are two levels, one for people who work in it all the time called occupational, and one for the general public. There are two types of exposure involved. Local exposure, where for example the head is resonant at some VHF frequencies, and whole body exposure, where the whole of the body gets warmed up. And there are three types of measurements that need to be done: the peak measurement, a measurement averaged over 6 minutes, and a measurement averaged over 30 minutes. But basically what it boils down to is that when you are transmitting, the general public can be in a region where these reference levels are not exceeded, and the boundary of that region depends on the antenna type. But the most important message of the whole presentation just came up. If there's nobody present in an area when you transmit, then there can be no human exposure. So what it boils down to is defining your exclusion zones, which become a compliance boundary. ICNIRP actually specifies in a 41-page guideline document how to take the measurements. It says you've got to compare your electric field and your magnetic fields at different frequencies with the limits. You've got to do it for greater than 6 minutes and less than 6 minutes, but you don't need to worry about it. That is all done for you in the 41-page ICNIRP document. The reference levels that come out of this are to be applied for general public exposure. And what has to be done by the calculators or the assessment methods is to compare the electric, magnetic and power density with the maximum levels, which are frequency dependent and are shown on this graph. Now, all of that looks complicated. It is complicated. And that's why we have a team of experts, 7 guys from RSGB and ARRL, who are working hard to interpret this for us and present ways of actually doing the assessment. So Ofcom in its document says that you can use a number of different ways to demonstrate compliance in the assessments that you take. So you can use a calculator, either the one that Ofcom themselves provide or other types of desktop calculators. You can follow manufacturers or installers' instructions. We particularly think that a major way of achieving it will be to use pre-assessed compliant configurations. And we published in the May Radcom and on the website the first of these, which was for HF dipoles. And we hope that that demonstrates the way that you can show a blanket compliance by setting a station up in certain ways. The other thing that can be done is to take measurements. That can be quite difficult. And I would particularly warn people to stay away from cheap field strength meters because they don't work. Field strength meters do work, but you don't get them for the sort of price that you can find them on popular internet auction sites. So you've got to make sure that people are not present in an area where the reference levels are exceeded when you are transmitting. Then, having used one of the 4 methods above, you need to keep a record of what you've done. And the best way of working this is to design your station such that it is compliant. And it's quite surprising how many people will find that that is the case already. So the new license condition, Ofcom have helpfully provided us with a flowchart. It's found in this document. And the first check that you need to do is, are you inherently compliant? And you're inherently compliant if your station is set up in a way such that it cannot transmit above 10 watts EIRP, equivalent isotropic radiated power. If your station doesn't transmit above 10 watts EIRP, then keep a record and the job is done. And in fact, our calculator helps by telling you whether that's true or not. If you are above the 10 watt EIRP limit, then you need to estimate the compliance distance, which is how far you've got to keep the general public away in order to stay below the reference levels. If you need to work it out, there are the 4 methods that I went through on the previous slide. And the important thing is that having done one or more of these assessments, you keep a record of why you're compliant and by what method. If you've worked out the compliance distance for the general public, the next thing you need to do is to work out some exclusion zones, which is where you've got to keep people out of while you're transmitting. So the first step that Ofcom outline in their flowchart is, are you or other radio amateurs the only people inside the compliance distance? If the answer is yes, keep a record of this, and there's no member of the general public present, you are compliant. If general public are present, are you able to make sure that they're far enough away from your antenna, or that they cannot access your antenna, such that you can satisfy the requirements of separation? If the answer to that is yes, keep a record, you're finished. If, however, people could get within the compliance distance or in the exclusion zone, then you need to either stop transmitting or change your configuration if people become present. And you could, for example, turn the power down while the people are passing through the area. Let's just explain a little bit about compliance distance. This on the left, by the way, is the full flow chart. I'm not expecting you to be able to read that. I've been through all the individual parts. So on the right here, I want to explain compliance distance. Compliance distance is the distance from the nearest part of the antenna to the nearest part of the person. That's what's calculated by the Ofcom calculator. And if you can satisfy that, then you are compliant. One simple way is if your power is such that the compliance distance is less than the height of the mast minus the height of the person, then there is nowhere at ground level where anybody can go where they will exceed the reference levels. Now, we have developed a calculator. We have been going through various versions, and we really thank everybody for their very useful feedback on this. We will continue to improve that calculator. We posted a video explaining how to use it on the website, rsgb.org/EMF. You can find the video. We posted that last Friday, a week ago, not yesterday. And up until just before I started this presentation, there have been 4,241 views of that video. So if you haven't had a look, I thoroughly recommend that you go and have a look. And what it does is it explains how you can enter the band you're operating on, the mode you're operating in, the power you're using, the feeder and the length of the feeder, the type of antenna you're using, and it will calculate the EIRP. If that EIRP, on average, happens to be less than 10 watts, then you are inherently compliant. If not, you will need to look at the compliance distance and work out what the exclusion zones are and how you keep people at least that far away while you're transmitting. Calculations of this type are not an exact science. This calculator, which is based on an engine supplied by Ofcom, is conservative. That means it may require you to keep a distance that's larger than what might be compliant, but it does work. It is an approved calculator, and if it gives you an answer, then you will be compliant. This is another view of the same condition, but this time I've included the compliance distance and you notice that for this 20-meter setup, I'm feeding 400 watts in. I'm running SSB process, which gives me a 50% duty cycle, 50% mode factor and 50% duty cycle. I'm running through 20 meters of RG58 cable. I'm running to a half-wave dipole, and the peak EIRP is about 500 watts. The average EIRP is about 125 watts. And the distance that's calculated is this Ofcom compliance distance here. That's 3.6 meters. And I have a mast height of 5 meters. So my vertical separation is 5 minus 1.8, which is 3.2 meters. And in order to achieve the compliance separation at 400 watts SSB, you just need to make sure that no members of the general public are within 1.8 meters of the shadow of the line between you on the ground. And I think a lot of stations will find that they comply with that particular setup. So how do you determine the exclusion zone? You need to work out where people could be. You need to make a sketch of those, note the separation distances. You need to calculate the compliance distance or use lookup tables for pre-assessed configurations. You can mark these as exclusion zones on your little sketch of your own yard. And remember, limits can only be exceeded when somebody is present. So if you identify the accessible areas and the exclusion zones and where they overlap, then you can see where you are going to have to take steps to keep people out. So one simple way of doing that is to go to Google Earth or Google Maps. And I know this is quite small, but I don't know if you can see a mast luffed over there. So there's a position of a mast there. There's also a VHF mast here and a shack in between. So you can go on to Google Earth and you can use their distance measure to measure the distance from your antenna to, in this case, a public footpath. And that turns out to be 22 meters. The public might be able to get a bit closer, but there's some pretty dense vegetation here and some fences to try and stop them. So by measuring the distances, you can define the exclusion zones. By using the calculator, you can define the exclusion zones. By measuring the distances, you can determine the accessible zones. And where they overlap is the area where you've got to make sure nobody is present. But what a lot of people find when they do this is that the area is well within their control. So let's have a look at what this exposure is about. And first of all, we'll start with looking at the electric field, the E field, around a dipole antenna. So the black line is a dipole. This dipole is way up in the air. And you can see the red zones are where the strongest parts of the electric field are. As we would expect, they're where the voltage is stronger, which is at the two ends of the dipole. The H field, on the other hand, has its maximum strength in the middle. In the case of an inverted V, of course, that's further away from the ground. If you put those together and run a detailed antenna model, then what you can do is to mark out the contours where, for a given power input, 400 watts, 200 watts, 50 watts from your transmitter, for the particular configuration, you can work out where the exclusion zones are, in this case, on a vertical slice through the antenna. What you can also do, and by the way, if none of those exclusion zones reach the ground level, the person is now represented as a spot where his feet are. If none of those, even at 400 watts input, touch the ground, then people can be anywhere at ground level without being exposed. to non-compliant conditions. If we look down on that same diagram, then what we see at ground level, there's the same zones. This time it looks like a bow tie. And I just point out that these distances are only 1 or 2 meters, even for 400 watts. That's all well and good for a resonant dipole, but as you change the frequency, so the peaks of the E and the H and the combined fields will move up and down the antenna. So what we recommend is the definition of rectangular exclusion zones. The blue boundary in this case at around 2 meters for 400 watts is the exclusion zone for this dipole. We have published the work of lots and lots of modeling of this. In fact, 2,600 runs were run. And what we've come up with is a table. This is the bit that the amateurs can use. So for any part of the providing any part of the radiating structure is more than 2.3 meters for the 80-meter band, is more than 2.3 meters above ground level, then you will be compliant. If you can't achieve the 2.3, or perhaps a more realistic example here is 400 watts on 80 meters, where it becomes 5.3 meters high, then you would also need to take into account the separation needed at ground level. And what the case that we had posted on the website is about, it says that if you keep a separation of 2.2 meters away, then you will achieve compliance. Now that's also an important number, because you want to try and make sure nobody can actually touch your antenna because of the problems that could be caused by touch currents. If we look at a different example, in this case a 40-meter inverted V, then we see, I'm only showing half the antenna here, then we see a similar pattern, and in this case for the 40-meter dipole, the horizontal separations are between 1/2 and 2 meters. You only need to keep 2 meters away at 400 watts. What this diagram shows is 3 zones. The red zone, which is where the field strength is well exceeded. The amber zone is an area that we recommend is treated as an exclusion zone, and the green zone is the area which is the compliance zone where people can be present. This is all described in pre-assessed configuration number 1, which is on the website. You can do the similar thing for a 2-meter Yagi. And here for 2 meters, voice FM, 100 watts, talking half the time, 50%, with 18 meters of RG213 feeder, a 6-element Yagi, then you aren't compliant automatically because the power level is 434 watts. But your compliance distance is 6.7 meters. Now 6.2 of that is taken up by the antenna being 8 meters up in the air, which means the separation horizontally at ground level is only 2.4 meters. So there is another factor that you can take into account, particularly for beam-like antennas like the 2-meter Yagi, and that is that the antenna gain is on the bore site of the antenna. The person is not on the bore site, so you can produce a less conservative compliance distance if you enter a directivity factor in the calculator. That's how many dBs down the antenna pattern will be when it's pointing horizontally, what the field will be down at where the person is in the elevation side lobe. So you can repeat this for accessible portions, and it gives you the exclusion zone to avoid people being present. There's a list there which Ofcom have published in their guidance document of the sort of things that you can record. I'm not expecting you to take them all in, but they are there. They're well defined, and you will be able to come back to them later in the presentation. So what is good practice to achieve this compliance? We should all aim to be compliant by design. I would recommend that you always follow manufacturers' instructions and guidelines. And yes, that does require you to read them. We also recommend you follow our advice with the way you set up your system, and you'll find that not only does that advice help you be compliant with the new condition, but actually makes your radio work better too. If you use the RSGB Ofcom calculator to give a compliance distance, that's it. You can use any calculation you want, but if you use a different calculation, you have to convince Ofcom, if they ask, why your answers are correct. Simplest thing to do is to separate and set up and operate to these pre-assessed configurations, which we'll be publishing more of in RADCOM and on the website. And if you end up with any exclusion zones, then either don't transmit when people are in them, turn the power down, or adjust your station such that people will not be in them. And generally speaking, if compliance is not achieved, not demonstrated, there are other ways using advanced modeling that you can make small tweaks to your system until you can demonstrate compliance. Perhaps the most encouraging thing of all is Ofcom's stated aim in this, which is they want to foster a climate of compliance, not a high-handed enforcement approach, but they will act against reckless individuals. And I must say thank you to all those in the EMF team who are helping us on this, particularly Ian, GM3, Sierra Echo Kilo, and Peter, Golf 4 Delta Sierra Echo. Great deal of work that they put in, many hundreds and hundreds of hours have been put in by some very skillful people, and I feel privileged to be part of their team. So, I don't know if any questions have come in, David, while I've been rattling away, but I'll hand back to you.
Hello, John. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions actually from somebody. But first, I'd like to remind you at home now, if you'd like to ask a question and haven't already done so, please do it as soon as you can, either on YouTube chat or the BATC messaging. Now, if you have been watching the formal part of our AGM just before this webinar on YouTube, then you may have to refresh your screen, your browser, to see the live chat feature. So please do that now. If you want to ask a question, then you should see the chat channel. And don't forget to include your first name and your call sign if you have one as well. We have got a question from John Harrison. It says, let's have ground-fed antenna. Both my neighbours fall within my exclusion zone. We keep seeing examples up on masts and towers, which lots of us can't have. So can we see numbers for 40 feet long plots? That's John Harrison.
Yes, John, I mean, you have asked this question to me directly as well, and I will be answering it. But the simple point is that we have to move on next to model vertical antennas and inverted L's, etc. We will be doing that. But the next step really is to make sure that Ofcom don't change their guidance or calculator when they finish their consultation and come out on May the 18th with what the final step will be. Once we've got that, we will get the group to undertake the modelling of the vertical antennas, the inverted L antennas, and other commonly used antennas, particularly down at the HF ranges.
So is that something, John, that you're expecting to have for the 18th of May when this starts becoming in force?
No, well, the 18th of May 2022, yes.
Oh, okay.
18th of May is when the regulations get introduced, and what we need to know is the final configuration of those before we actually do all of the work. I mean, when we're doing thousands of runs, we don't want to have to redo them if they change the limits slightly.
No, okay, understood. John also has a PS there saying my neighbours are out in the garden at the moment on a Saturday afternoon. So does that mean no radio, or is he wrong, he says?
Well, I don't know his particular detail, but the answer is it doesn't mean no radio. It may mean he needs to turn his power down a little bit, or I think his particular problem is on the 80, 40 and 20 metre bands from memory of his questions before.
Sure, okay. Got another question here from, all I've got of a name is Uncle Remus, but he says, or she says, will Ofcom check?
I'm not qualified to answer that question. All they need to do to check for compliance is the same as they need to have done in the past to check whether you are staying within your license condition for maximum power. It's the same equipment, but whether they will check or not, I don't know. I suspect if they are told there is a problem, they will do some spot checks.
Okay. And this is all really for the safety, isn't it? It's being accountable for your station and safety for the public. I have a little question myself, actually, just to add in, if I may. So if this mainly is okay, you've got maybe a decent plot of land with lots of clearance around it, do you have to make any provision for example, when people come visit, when the postman delivers, or you have other people come round who you're not expecting, or the general public? Do you have to cover that in your assessment as well?
Well, basically, if any member of the general public, which includes your family, friends and visitors, are present in an exclusion zone, then you should not transmit. But presumably, if people are visiting, I mean, the postman is an example where he's going to walk in and walk out unless he stops to talk. And he's not going to be there for 6 minutes, so he's not going to be exposed. But people who are maybe having a picnic in your garden or a barbecue, yes, you must not transmit at power when they are present.
Yeah, sure, okay. I've got Vic152, that's all I've got as a name. What about radials, he says?
Radials come in two types, elevated and buried. There will need to be a separation from radials, and as part of the verticals that we're going to do, we will be trying to measure how much that is, but we suspect if they are buried radials, it will be less than the separation from the actual radiating part of the antenna.
Sure. Actually, John, sorry to interrupt, but Vic's come back with another point just straight after that. Are radials part of an antenna? Therefore, exclusion zone starts from where the radials end.
There will be an exclusion zone from where the radials end, but it might be quite a small distance. We don't know till we've done the modelling. Okay,
thank you. Steve F4 VTF says thank you very much for the detailed explanation, John. Several other people saying thank you as well. Andy Cowley has said been great, but how about CB radios? So I guess at least in my day they were 27 megs. How does it apply to them?
Well, Ofcom have said that it applies to all radios, licensed or unlicensed, and that they are setting up the conditions to apply to everybody equally. Right,
okay. Pete M0OFM says, how does this affect stroke meter operation, I guess mobile that is, operation, especially those of us who use radio from vehicles while commuting?
The conditions will still apply, so you will need to keep a separation distance. If you're not commuting in London and you're on the move, of course, you're helped by the 6-minute averaging interval, in that if you stop at lights, you can stop transmitting, and when you're moving along, providing there's nobody within the compliance distance for more than 6 minutes, then you should be okay.
Okay. Dale MM0INH says, similar to John H's question earlier, antennas where the houses are part of the antenna supports, either as a pole or the chimney or as a support for a dipole leg. So he says that modelling for that would be really useful as well later on.
Yes, we have to. I mean, we have published the modelling for dipoles, for HF dipoles for the 4080 and 160, and the separation is only a couple of meters at the end. It becomes more difficult if the dipole passes over the roof, and we will model that. I should say, with all of this modelling, if we have any other experts listening to this who have the experience of using the NEC 5 modelling tool, which is what we're using, then we would welcome their help in doing and developing some of the models.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure you'd welcome. You told me earlier how many thousands of emails you've got sitting waiting for you. So, once again, we're very grateful for all you're doing for us today, John. I've got Uncle Remus has come back. I'm guessing he might be a CB user because he says, I think we should be licensed again. If we have to conform with such measures, bring back the license, he says. So I'm just guessing that might be his handle, Uncle Remus. Pete Hayward, M0VPH, says, I contacted John regarding my setup last week, so I guess you'll be getting around to that amongst the thousands of emails, John. John Harrison's come back, G0UBE, and says, as I see it, my 400 watt license isn't worth the paper it's written on. QRP with a limited antenna is useless from here. I've been trying for 30 years. Have you got any rays of hope or any thoughts for him? I think, by the way, sorry, John, just to explain, I think he was the gentleman who gave us the very first question today, which is where he has neighbours and things that could get in that exclusion zone quite easily.
Yeah, he has been corresponding with me anyway, and we pointed out some things. I have said to him several times already that I would be very surprised if we have to give up transmitting, and I would, even with his, I think it's a 40-foot garden, is it? He's got 43 foot.
I think it was, yes, yeah.
I think that there will be configurations that he can use, possibly not at 400 watts, but certainly he'll find configurations he can use at 50 and 100 watts. And, hopefully we can help him. But as you hinted, I've had over 4,000 emails on this topic from nearly 400 different individuals. So I apologise if I'm not answering them as quickly as people would like.
I'm sure,
and
but
some of them I've had 10 or 12 emails. Some people I've had 10 or 12 emails from. So.
Sure. Actually, John, I'm going to put a link now on the screen for everybody. It was in amongst your slides. This is a very good part of the RSGB website to go to, though, if you're trying to find out more information about this. It's rsgb.org/EMF. So if you go to that, you'll find lots of information that's particularly relevant for radio amateurs as well. We've had another couple of comments regarding CB. A couple of people have said that they think that the limits on CB is 4 watts. And then someone else said, Gordon Hudson GM4 SVM says, I thought it only applied to transmissions over 10 watts, so that CB wouldn't be affected if it is still the limit 4 watts.
Well, if it's 4 watts EIRP, then it is below 10 watts. If it's 4 watts ERP, then normally it would be below 10 watts EIRP, but it does depend on the antenna.
Okay.
But the Ofcom have done it for what they call all spectrum users.
All right, John, thank you. Got a couple of nice lots of compliments for you as well. Jim G3YLA over on BATC says, great presentation, John. Very helpful, thank you. Chris Carini has GW4, RER says, excellent and clear explanation. Thanks for all you do. And John Harrison's come back and said, again, a big thank you, John, for all of your work and all of your team as well. One of the things I was going to ask about mobile operation, because I know quite a few of us only have maybe the time to work mobile, and someone's already mentioned it today. Do you see that maybe a sign on a vehicle, maybe near the rear window, if that's where you've got your antenna, or near where you've got your antenna, is that going to help you be compliant more if it says warning, radiation emanates from this antenna?
Well, one of the ways that Ofcom say that you can protect your exclusion zone is by putting up notices advising the public. I mean, for example, if you drive off in your vehicle and you set up at an SES, then if you put up notices and keep people out of the exclusion zone, then you will be compliant. And the point I regularly make to people is that if you're going to conduct an SES, then you need to do a risk assessment. Part of that risk assessment will be the mast or whatever's holding the antenna up falling down. And I'm almost certain that there is no configuration where the separation of the mast falling down for a reasonable antenna is going to be less than the EMF required separation.
Okay. All right, I think that helps there very much, John. Thank you. Just a reminder now, because we're coming towards the end of our webinar, so if you've been waiting to ask a question, then do ask it now. And if you were watching on the AGM, the formal part of the AGM on YouTube earlier, then do refresh your screen if you can't see the messages coming up, the live chat, to ask us that. Pete M0VPH says, I have had a conversion, James Brazen, I'm not quite sure what that means, a conversation that possibly is, with James Brazen from Ofcom. He went through my setup and showed me that I am compliant using 400 watts, using a Hustler 5BTV vertical ground mounted. So some good news there from Pete. Do you have any experience of that particular vertical?
Yes, I've got one in my back garden.
All right.
It's about 5 metres away from a public footpath.
So is that, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot now. So is that the sort of time? No. But is that the sort of distance, John, that you've got to be from that?
All right. Because I haven't had time to work out my own
tell you,
example.
I know a man who can help you. Oh, it's you. Sorry. But you haven't had time. No, quite right. The transmitters, we've still got people talking about CB here, which is great because I must admit, I can remember 4 watts being mentioned when that first 2781 or something came in. But people are saying that it's now 12 watts SSB. In fact, someone has said now transmitters is their name on here. It says UKCB permits 19.8 watts EIRP, yet the EMF reg does not apply. So I don't know about that. I'm really sorry. Maybe John, unless you've got any other knowledge about the UKCB permits, have you?
Well, as I said, I have no knowledge about CB. I've not been a CB, I'm afraid. But when we have had meetings with Ofcom, and it really is a question to them, they have said that any person who transmits, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, above 10 watts EIRP will break the ICMERP regulations unless they do an assessment and keep a record.
Right. Okay. So I think...
So I should rephrase that. Will break the Ofcom implementation of the ICMERP regulations. There are no ICMERP regulations.
Okay, there is lots of other information, by the way, as well as on the RSGB website about this generally for radio spectrum users on the Ofcom website as well, of course. Rosalind Wicks says, can you add more antennas to the XL calculator, i.e. a doublet, end fed, etc.? And also, if we use this to 1998 levels, what happens if we move to 2020? Will we need to redo all of this? That's Rosalind.
Two excellent questions, Rosalind. The first one is, in order to add more antennas, what I need is more volunteers to actually build up a simple table for each of the antennas and each of the frequencies on which it operates the gain in dBi. Once we can do that, we can add any number of antennas, but there are just not enough hours in the day for me and my team to actually fill it in. So anybody who's here who wants to help, something that's easy to do at home, I can send you a spreadsheet. You can add your columns, we'll get the new rows, we'll get somebody else to check them, and then we can put them straight into the spreadsheet because all of the limits are looked up in data tables. We're very thankful to Alwyn, who did that for us for the feeders. So the feeder is now fully implemented, but the antennas aren't. The second question is the area where most of the work is going on at the moment, and that is ICMERP 2020 limits. The reason that becomes difficult, and the reason that we're having discussions with HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, PHE, Public Health England, and Ofcom, is that there are requirements for peak limits in the ICMERP 2020 which weren't there in ICNA 1998, and they are much more stringent. For example, the E field must, below 10 megahertz, be less than 83 volts per meter, whereas the previous limits were 2 to 3 times higher than that.
I guess we know a lot more about this sort of thing now as well. I've got Nick M1DDD says, thanks John and David, just clarifying timing of when the legislation comes into force. The 18th of May is when it starts, isn't it, John? But can you clarify it? And also on the different bands as well.
The 18th of May is the date at which Ofcom say they're going to implement the change to the licence conditions. Because they realise that this is a new requirement, they have allowed 6 months for frequencies above 10 megahertz, and they will not be able to say you are in breach of the condition within that period, because they're giving you 6 months to go away and do the work. That was for frequencies above 10 megahertz. For frequencies below 10 megahertz, and this is for 2 reasons that I'll come to at the end, they're giving us 12 months from May 2021, which takes us to May 2022. The 2 reasons are that the antenna structures are bigger, and therefore the separation distances, and in particular being close into the antenna in what's called the reactive near field, is difficult. The second reason is the one I just mentioned, which is to do with when you go below 10 megahertz, then you have the problems of the peak limits for the electrostimulation type impacts.
Okay, thank you, John. Still got a few people commenting, and it's not that I'm ignoring those at all. I mean, David G0EVA says the amount of work involved in compliance and the limitations show the effect of this directive, 100 years of radio transmissions and then this pointless imposition. He says, well, I don't think we can really comment on the politics of it. I'm sure John would feel the same as well. The Ofcom did actually put this out for consultation, and you had until a week or 2 ago, I think, to actually make your feelings known, didn't you, John? So
there were 3 stages of consultation, and the other thing we should do is really thank the people who helped us and supported us by putting things in. There were 255 responses went in from amateurs, and they resulted in 10 significant changes to the legislation, all in our benefit. The biggest one of all is the fact that the RSGB can now do pre-assessed configurations, which, if followed, will be recognised by Ofcom as being compliant. I mean, that is a really major step forward, because without that, you would have to do all the detailed modelling yourself, whereas we can get blanket compliance, which, if the setups are followed by any amateur, will make them compliant.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, again, there's quite a lot on here on CB. I'm honestly not ignoring it. Many of us have come into this hobby from an early interest in CB, and then they've then come into amateur radio. So we're certainly not against it, but there's too much really for us to go into. But one person did put up a comment about CB. That was Steve Morton, who says the information on power limits for CB are contained in the Ofcom document located here. He hasn't got that on there. So in other words, on the Ofcom website, you will find the information that applies to all radio spectrum users, including CBers as well. So please look on there as well. We've got another comment from David, G81IDL, says, from 10 to 30 megs, I only use a magnetic loop 1 meter in diameter. How does this affect the calculations, he says?
Well, we've actually had a volunteer do a lot of work on mag loops, and one of the experts on our committee from ARRL, Kai, is also an expert on mag loops. So we hope that in the not too distant future, we will be able to put out a pre-assessed configuration for mag loop type antennas. And one sort of comment, without having all the detailed modelling in front of me, is that the danger from touching the very high voltage at the capacitor means you probably want to stay 2 or 3 meters away And that, surprisingly enough, is probably what you need to be compliant with EMF.
Okay, thank you. A question, just a clarification, I think, of the dates from Nick Gar 7. So the initial change to licence conditions is May 2021, brackets, i.e. 6 metres and 12 metres and plus above 12 metres, right? Or is it May 2020? It is May 2021, isn't it, from the 18th of May? But then they have 6 months to comply with the reporting and everything.
For frequencies above 10 megahertz and 12 months for frequencies below 10 megahertz.
Yep.
So the time at which they can enforce is November this year for above 10 megahertz and May next year, if I got the dates wrong, 2022.
I think it's just that, to be honest, John, I think we're both guilty of not mentioning the date, the year. So
Yeah.
we are talking about here, this comes in May 2021, so
May
next
the
month.
18th is the target, yep.
Yep, and of course, well, people may be watching this in months or even years to come. So we are talking about May. We're talking now in April 2021, and we're talking about this coming in the 18th of May 2021, and then progressively either 6 months or 12 months from there. But all these details and lots more you can find on the RSGB link that I mentioned, which is rsgb.org/EMF. John, M0JBMs. John, I have a DX Commander which has radials that are lying just about under gravel that takes up most of my garden. I think I'll have to take it down or maybe just run 10 watts, he asks.
I think you'll be able to run more than 10 watts, but we need to get the job done properly. Me sort of standing here and saying what I think isn't helping. We need to do the assessment and prove it.
Yeah. A couple of suggestions here. Dave Delahaye suggested that people could have CCTV and keep an eye, maybe when they're in their shack, and keep an eye on if anybody comes down in the garden and things. And of course, if they've made the effort to do that, then they could make sure that the public or nobody else could get near the antennas when you're transmitting. That's if you haven't got anything going outside the curtilage of your ground, I guess. Because Kevin Earl has also come back that and said for remote cameras to monitor possible public or neighbours coming in.
Yeah, I have cameras on my antennas, and also I know of somebody who's put up PIR beams.
Right. Okay.
So that, if somebody crosses them, then you get an alarm, you stop transmitting while you go out and see who's there.
Okay.
And a lot of the CCTV cameras, of course, have human movement detection, the doorbells, for example.
Indeed.
And you could set one of those up and it would alert you if somebody was in the area.
Yes, that's a very good idea as well. So thanks to those of you who suggested that, to Dave and to Kevin there. M0JBM John says, I've got a DX Commander which has radials that are lying just... Oh no, I've read that one, I'm sorry. John M7CPT says, amateur radio on the air. Do you have anyone working on T2FD or TTFD antennas, he says?
I don't know what they are, sorry.
Okay. I mean, one of the things I think it's important to say, and John has already mentioned it here, is you can imagine John, like many of us in the RSGB, are volunteers, and he's got quite a team working on this. But if you've got the knowledge and experience and some time to give to this, and you maybe have got a particular antenna yourself, and you can help John and his team, then please do write to him. I mean, at the moment, I know John is besieged with lots of emails, people asking for some help on things. But conversely, if you can offer some help, you can either contact John via the RSGB, or maybe, John, if you'd like to give out your email address now, I guess it's your call sign at, is it? Would you like to do that?
It's Mike Zero, Juliet Alpha Victor, or as I like to say, Mike Zero, just another volunteer, at rsgb.org.uk.
All right, so if you can help John, and not just ask for help, but if you can help in any way, maybe you could just take on one project to look at one antenna. I know that would really help the team, wouldn't it? Trevor M0BPU says, I've got PEPs on all sides. I have arranged my STL mag loop on a safe. Sorry. I have arranged a proximity detector to monitor, as I cannot see if the person is in the garden. Is this acceptable, he says?
I believe it is.
Okay, short and sweet. Thank you very much. Dave Goodwin, M0TTJ, says, are we required to submit our assessment to Ofcom, or will it be sufficient to make the assessment and retain it until requested by Ofcom, i.e. a soft copy of the output of the calculator enough? Good question, Dave.
Yes, it is sufficient, and they don't want you to submit it. In Germany, you have to submit them, but in the UK, you just have to have kept them a PDF on your computer of a PDF copy of our spreadsheet, as an example. The front sheet on your computer is all that's needed.
So that's one of the advantages of using the RSGB adapted version of the calculator, isn't it? That it's got a lot of the relevant things for radio amateurs, the types of antennas and cables and everything that we use regularly. And of course, you'll be adding to this as other volunteers help and give you more information about specific aerials as well.
But the calculator also gives you the opportunity in the beige boxes to fill in the details of your configuration when you did the assessment. So it's all in one.
Yeah, it's all, and you can just print that and put it with your license, I guess, would be a really good way of doing it. Then
or keep it on a file on your desktop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, keep it electronic or real.
I'm all for preserving trees.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. John M7 CPT comes back and just explains what his terms were. An FTD was folded terminated dipoles. He did mention that earlier on. The tilted, and the TTFD was a tilted terminated folded dipole. Essexham have come back and said that as well. So do you have any specific advice on those? I guess is what they're asking, is if you've got anything specific on those particular antenna?
We haven't yet, but I would be surprised if they are significantly different to a normal dipole. They're just shorter. Because of the terminations. I don't know. I've not dealt with them. So.
Sure. Okay, that's fine. Well, again, a plea from John and from me. If you can help with any of these, if you've got these particular antenna and you can help get some information on them, then please have a look at his website. Get in touch with John, and I'm sure he'll welcome that information, that feedback in here. John, from Mike Meadows, sorry, this is. John, I have a covert 100-foot circumference, a continuous loop at 10 AGL running above ground level, I guess, running along plastic gutters and eaves at both ends, tuned with a CG3000 auto tuner, 160 to 10 meters. Clearly, I'm inside the loop. So I guess he's asking, though, how that would affect. But him being inside is not the problem, is it? It's really protecting against the public.
Well, if it's only him in his house, then there are no requirements for amateurs. I mean, in many countries they use occupational limits, but in the UK Ofcom have not required that. So if he's the only one in the house at the time, then he can do what he likes.
Okay, all right.
We wouldn't recommend it. We would recommend that he stays outside the occupational exclusion zone, but Ofcom have not put that requirement on.
No, this is all about others, isn't it, really? Yeah. Nick Gar 7 says, does the assessment apply to the ham operator, herself, or just others? He says
it doesn't apply. You are not required to maintain the compliance distance for radio amateurs who either the owner of the station or other people working with him. And that's specifically dealt with in the Ofcom guidance documents for amateurs.
Okay, thank you. On BATC now, Jim G3YLA has got a question. Is it worth the RSGB generating a planning statement relating to need to vertical separation for antennas based on this new directive, i.e. a planning applications to councils and things like that?
We are trying very hard to keep planning and EMF separate, and I think if you want advice on planning, you should use I've forgotten the exact email address, but it'll be something like planning@rsgb.org.uk.
Okay, I think you could find that by looking at the RSGB website, rsgb.org. Terry G3VFC says, calculations using estimated properties of the Earth and other environment must be, at best, a guess. What hope for affordable or communal test and measuring equipment, he says?
Well, even if you have measuring equipment, that will give you an accurate field, then you still have to follow a very detailed procedure in actually taking the measurements. So it is difficult. The calculations are all designed to be conservative. In other words, they are designed to slightly overestimate the compliance distance. So because of that, they are still our recommended way of doing the compliance. Now, validation is a difficult task, and one of the ways that we are validating the models that we're using is to run them on NEC 4.2 and NEC 5, which, although they sound like the same product, are completely different modeling and calculation engines. And if the segmentation that we do for the antennas gives the same answers in both ways, then that is confirmation as to the efficacy of the answers.
Okay, John, thank you. Dave Delahaye has said, are there plans to have a web-based calculator running on the RSGB website?
We would like to provide a web-based calculator, but we have had a couple of people recently point out to us that they're worried about the security of a web-based calculator. So the original reason for making it web-based was that we were having difficulty with it working on different free spreadsheet programs. I think it's now working on quite a big selection. The latest problem that I heard of was somebody had trouble with a Raspberry Pi and LibreOffice, but a lot of the early problems of it not running on older versions of the spreadsheets have gone away, and certainly while we are prototyping it, we're going to carry on running the spreadsheets because they're much easier to develop and check than a detailed web-based calculator. But it's still on the plan to develop one if needed, but not in the next couple of months.
No, and I guess maybe it's another case of asking you if you've got expertise in something like that, web-based calculators and things. I'm sure that John and his team would welcome some help or advice if you can offer it. Dave actually came back and also added, field days are a breeze to manage as long as everyone on the site are radio amateurs. All radio amateurs are exempt from being excluded in the exclusion zones, he says.
Yep, that's what we just said as well.
Okay. NR, just initials there, I'm afraid, is what if you're running 5 watts RF on VHF, UHF with an X50 collinear antenna with wires and CE4 FM digital? That's one of those digital modes, isn't it? C4 FM. I don't know. I mean, I guess you need a bit more information, but that's 5 watts basically on an X50 collinear on VHF, UHF. Does the mode have much to do with it, John?
The mode affects the averaging, but if he's on VHF, he'll probably be running 100% on an FM mode, which doesn't reduce the power level. But it does have a very significant effect. SSB, for example, is only a fifth of the power of VHF FM.
Right. So, I mean, I believe CE4 FM is one of these hybrid sort of digital modes as well. So
there'll certainly be 100. Well, FT8, I think, is 42% because of the transmit-receive periods. But all of those things do affect the results.
Yeah. Essex Hams have come and said, maybe worth mentioning applicability to family. We've been told that family and non-licensed visitors are general public. Can John confirm that this is his understanding too?
Yes.
Okay, right. I think we're getting there now, really. I think
we actually asked Ofcom that question and they confirmed it back to us.
Right. Thank you. I don't think I've covered this one. Terry G3VFC says calculations using estimated properties of the Earth. Oh no, I have mentioned that one, I think, haven't I? Sorry, there's quite a few questions. I'm trying to group them together, so I ask them at the same sort of time. John Harrison said, I've put an antenna into the calculator. If you change 50 watts input or 400 watts input, the EIRP changes as you would expect, but the exclusion distance does not change. Is that correct, he asks?
It will be if the exclusion distance is less than the height of the mast.
Right. Okay. So that's there.
I think he is meaning compliance distance, but yeah.
Yeah.
It also depends on the bands, because what Ofcom have done is to limit, because of the problem of being in the radiated near field, whereby the equation that you use to convert from EIRP to either electric or magnetic field strength relies on a circular wave and 377 ohms of impedance, wave impedance. That doesn't apply close into the antenna. So what Ofcom have done with their version 2 of the calculator is to stop it at HF from giving answers which are less than lambda on 2 pi, the reactive near field distance of the antenna. So they won't give an answer that's less than that, but they are going to revisit that calculator and look again at what they provide, what we provide, and they provide below 10 megahertz after the end of this referendum that has just finished on the 18th of April.
Fine. Thank you, John. Just 2 more questions. I'm going to leave it there then, I think, because I know that you've been on this call since 12 o'clock when the AGM started, so it's going to be quite a day. From Andy Cowley, VK3UM EMR software works on an all-op system, he says, so that's good advice. Brian Morrison says, need to know feeder loss, antenna gain, antenna gain and pattern, and antenna distance from people. With 5 watts, can't believe you can exceed limits for an external antenna.
Well, anybody who works in microwave will know that you can get 20 dB gain antennas, which was much less than 5 watts. For the VK3UM system, the Australian regulations use different limits, and unfortunately the author of that excellent piece of software is now SK, so getting it updated would be difficult. There are many different calculators around, but you've got to watch that for Ofcom to accept them, they have to be working to ICNIRP 1998 and eventually ICNIRP 2020 limits. And I don't know of any calculator out there at the moment published. RSGB has one that it hasn't published yet that works to ICNIRP 2020 levels. The other one that is quite common is the IARU Region 1 called ICNIRP Calc. I was getting disturbed by movement in the background.
That's all right. We just saw a mysterious hand appearing then, don't worry. But it did look a little odd.
That's my wife.
That is I'm sure you have definitely deserved it. John, I think I'm going to leave it there because I know we've got a couple of other just comments, but mainly, honestly, people saying thank you very much. I know you and your team have put a lot of work into that, and I know it's only just beginning as well. And those 3,000 or 4,000 emails that you've got to get through. Just like to remind you again at home, if you'd like to know more information, obviously the Ofcom website, who have this directive, then there's lots of information on there. And there's another web address as well, rsgb.org/EMF. Lots of information on there. But John, as I said, it's been a very long day for you, I know. So thank you ever so much for today. And thank you for all the work that you and your team are doing. And I'm sure, and if you can help John, by the way, and his team, don't forget, it's not just take. If you can give something back as well, John's just a volunteer, as is all his team. So if you can help at all, then please get in touch. But John Rogers, M0JAV, thank you ever so much for today.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for your useful questions. It's those, we've had a lot of help in developing this stuff from people sending in comments. And I just ask you to bear with me if you have sent me an email and I haven't answered. I don't mind a gentle reminder, but I would prefer that to a complaint that I haven't responded yet.
Yeah, and keep an eye on the website, of course, because that's an easy way for you to communicate instantly with lots of people, isn't it?
Yes.
All right, John, thank you ever so much, and have that well-earned cup of tea and something to eat, no doubt, as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, John. There we are. And just to let you know that the RSGB produces other online webinars such as the monthly Tonight at 8 series. So to find out more or to send us any comments or feedback, please visit rsgb.org/webinars. And remember, if you subscribe to the RSGB's YouTube channel, you'll automatically be notified of all upcoming webinars, as well as other new videos and presentations from the Society on a wide range of amateur radio topics. We hope you've enjoyed this special presentation and look forward to seeing you again very soon. But for now, this is David G7ERP signing off and clear. Bye-bye.